Hi, greetings from a hotel in Orlando. I hope you all can hear me okay. I'm going to trust that this is possible. So it is a pleasure to be here, and I'm thrilled to be able to participate. We had some COVID challenges, and so it means so much more to be able to spend some time with you this afternoon, this morning, talking about some of the things that we're passionate about. And so I'm going to share my screen and start a presentation. Great. All right. And so that's a little bit of a screen that you'll be able to see. And I will get started. I think can you all see that all right? I hope so.
Yep, it's just fine. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. All right. Well, Ilex counterpoint. To cevar mate, take the cured gourd or the cattle horn wampa or whatever else you wish to use as a cup and fill it 2/3, 1/2 to 2/3 with loose yerba leaves, covering the opening tightly with your hand. Turn the receptacle upside down and shake it gently to undo any clumps in the powder and to make sure the leaves and the small twigs are evenly distributed. Then take the long drinking straw, bombilla, and jam its filtered end all the way to the bottom of the yerba, keeping it closer to one side of the cup. This will give you a lot of surface area on the mate powder over which you pour the water. If you're drinking mate that is hot, pour heated but not boiling water onto the yerba in the gourd, filling it up so that the water lifts the leaves ever so gently and air bubbles start to form on the surface. If you're using a cow horn to drink ice cold tereré, the water you'll use is chilled and may already be infused with fresh yuyos, herbs for traditional remedies. Wait a few minutes until the yerba powder has absorbed all the water and then give the first real pour. Use the bombilla to drain the gourd or the wampa until you can hear that you're sucking air. That sound is where the word tereré comes from, an onomatopoetic rendition in Guarani of the sounds of sucking up the drink in a bombilla. It's customary for the cebador, the person preparing mate for the group, to take the first few pours and sips to remove the initial bitterness from the drink before pouring water again and passing it on to someone else. Everyone in the round of mate or tereré takes a turn fully emptying the cup with the same bombilla, passing it back to the cebador, who refills it and gives it to the next person. Yerba mate is the world's third most popular natural caffeinated drink, behind tea and coffee. Made from the dried leaves and tender shoots of Ilex paraguayensis, mate comes from an evergreen holly tree that grows in the subtropical Atlantic forests in the heart of South America. In Argentina, southern Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, mate is a stimulating beverage of choice, giving its drinkers the jolt of liquid effervescence others might get from caffeinated drinks originally from East Africa or Asia. Consumed from pre-colonial times in South America by indigenous communities, under Spanish colonial rule, mate expanded far beyond its natural growing range to become the leading beverage after wine and water in the viceroyalty of Peru, as it was wildly popular in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Peru, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Today, mate has made its mark in the Levant, bombilla included, as Lebanon and Syria have become the world's leading importers of mate outside of South America. And the drink has gotten new life in the North Atlantic world as a blended energy drink or pre-packaged in single-serving tea bags. No bombilla required. While yerba mate is the best known, the Americas have an Ilex fix. In fact, yerba mate is part of a continuity of Ilex usage for caffeine and spiritual potency in the Western Hemisphere. Of the more than 400 species of hollies distributed across the world, 3 found in the Americas are known to possess a combination of psychoactive substances, xanthines like caffeine, that set them apart. And notably, they've been used continually from pre-contact to the present. Yerba mate, Ilex paraguayensis, and guayusa, Ilex guayusa in South America, Yopan, the unfortunately named Ilex vomitoria in North America. For at least 2,000 years, the humble leaves of Ilex have been used to make important stimulating beverages in the Americas. There's a good chance, in fact, that anyone watching this talk in the Western Hemisphere lives not too far from naturally occurring stimulant Ilex. Stretching from the southeastern coast of North America through central Mexico, across the western fringe of the Amazonian rainforest, and tracing the curves of the Paraná River in the heart of South America, vastly different species of Ilex were used by indigenous groups since time immemorial. Early Spanish explorers on a quest for New World riches and wonders were taken by the rituals around Ilex. And in spite of the great distances and the vast differences between the three, there are striking similarities in how they were prepared and consumed, according to the earliest reports. All three were first dried before being prepared as a drink. Yopan and mate were roasted. Guayusa and yopan feature in core rituals accompanied by other potent plants. The ayahuasca ceremony for the former, guayusa, the black drink ceremony for yopan. All three were associated with ritualized, convivial emesis. And all three were consumed out of gourds. But whereas mate is a globalized beverage, having expanded throughout the southern part of the Spanish Empire and then beyond, guayusa and yopan are relatively obscure today. What is it that makes mate so different from its cousins? Why are guayusa and yopan so unknown, even in the case of the latter, where they're grown as common yard decor? From the first point of contact, the three beverages have iterated between ceremony, medicine, and caffeinated tea. As inhabitants of the Americas, indigenous, settler, colonial, African, have wielded the leaves' properties to different culturally situated aims. Today's talk unfolds and unpacks these kinds of questions by focusing on the lesser known Ilex, yopan, and guayusa. So let's go to yopan. Years after a 1528 shipwreck off the coast of Texas resulted in a meandering journey through the mainland and eventually into central Mexico, Spanish explorer Cabeza de Vaca wrote in his memoirs of the people and customs he encountered in North America, mentioning yopan in print for the first time. They drink there another thing that they make from the leaves of trees like that of the holly oak, and that which they have drunk, they throw up, which they do very easily and without any shame. In 1542, less than 20 years after the shipwreck, Cabeza de Vaca was appointed governor of the Rio de la Plata province, which with its seat in Asunción, Paraguay, which is in the heart of South America. Though he does not mention it directly in his writings, in Paraguay, he came across multiple indigenous groups that prepared and drank yet another stimulating Ilex. Indeed, Cabeza de Vaca's entire sojourn in the Americas, from Florida to Texas to Paraguay, was among Ilex consuming groups, though he only wrote about it once. Hundreds of years later, during the US Civil War, Walter Lenoir wrote his Mother of Life at Camp Lee, South Carolina. We've been out of coffee for some time, but are doing very well without it, and have all become so fond of yopan tea that we will continue to use it, end quote. European expansion into the Western Hemisphere famously began as a pursuit of exotic consumables, many with desirable psychoactive properties. And Lenoir's happy experience with the yopan holly was just one of many colonial and settler encounters with the evergreen shrub that grows along the southeastern coast of North America. Separated by hundreds of years and hundreds of miles, both Cabeza de Vaca and Lenoir stumbled upon the sole caffeinated beverage native to North America, yopan, sometimes called cassina. Yopan was once so popular in Europe that it was traded and consumed in Paris and London throughout the 18th century, and was common enough that French visitors to Mississippi recognized the drink as something they had already consumed. John Locke, yes, that John Locke, writing in 1671 on behalf of the Lords Proprietors who oversaw the colonial settlement of Carolina, requested that samples of cassini be brought back to England with a view towards potential commodities in the colonies. The puzzling question is then, why is yopan not the caffeinated drink of choice in the United States? Well, let's unpack that. The name yopan comes from the Catawba for small tree. Cassina comes from Asi, creek, or muskegee for leaf. Yaupon is naturally found in the sandy soils of the North American coast from Virginia Beach to Texas, and it grows easily from seed and transplants successfully. This is important. Especially compared to mate, which 18th century writer James Adair noted when he wrote that the Indians transplant it and are extremely fond of it. In addition to caffeine, yaupon also possesses theobromine, the alkaloid which draws its name from chocolate, which is also found in yerba mate and guayusa, and theophylline, which is found in tea and yerba mate and guayusa. These and other properties made yaupon desirable. By measuring the residue presence of all three alkaloids in the drinking vessels, archaeologists have recently determined that yaupon and possibly Black drink ceremonialism was present at Cahokia, the pre-Columbian city located in what is now southwest Illinois, hundreds of miles outside of yaupon's growing range, indicating a lively trade in the leaf. Early and British and Irish visitors to the Carolina coasts wrote that indigenous inhabitants of those coasts traded it inland. The Black drink ceremony, so named in English because of the color of the liquid, immediately caught the attention of explorers, missionaries, and military alike, who described the cultural context for the drink. Black drink was taken during council meetings, before important events, notably the annual Green Corn Harvest Festival, the Busk, which featured heavily in American literature, including, for example, Thoreau's Walden. Women first heated the water in which to boil the leaves, and then by pouring the drink from one container to another, preparers frothed the liquid. The male leader of the ceremony, a position of high prestige and honor, would then sing a series of notes before partaking of the drink and then passing it around. Frothing or foaming seems to have been an important part of preparing sacred beverages in much of indigenous America. For example, chocolate was frothed in Mesoamerica. According to most early writers, women prepared yaupon as a decoction, boiling the leaves in water for a set length of time rather than steeping or percolation, which might be more common for coffee or tea. And most, though not all, records assert that only certain adult men were allowed to partake of the drink. But it was not the preparation that served as the focus of much colonial writing in English. Instead, the focus was on what happened after imbibing. Ceremony participants easily and regularly regurgitated the Black drink. So strong is the rhetorical link between yaupon and regurgitation that the U.S. Department of Agriculture Fire Service listed Ilex vomitoria as an emetic well into the 21st century. But in spite of its unfortunate name, yaupon is not in any way an emetic. Scientific study after study has tested its chemical components and found no known emetics. 16th century Spanish writers noted that indigenous groups in Florida, where I am right now, mixed salt water with caseina to encourage regurgitation. And today, some Southeast indigenous groups mix other local plants with yaupon to make the Black drink emetic. And I've had yaupon many times. It is quite delightful, and I'm happy to give tips on which ones to try. It's really quite wonderful. Public ritualized regurgitation disrupted Anglophone notions of gentility and was instrumental and instrumentalized to depict Native Americans as savage. Yet politicians and writers around the time of independence recognized and appreciated the importance of the Black drink. In a 1775 speech to the, quote, beloved men, headmen, and warriors of the Cherokee Nation on the eve of war, one of the beloved men of South Carolina, as he described himself, Congressman William H. Drayton, tried to convince the Federation not to join the British side, but instead ally with the revolutionaries by appealing to the Black drink. So, a little bit of the initial context. Next, because North America's southern coast lay for centuries divided between French, Spanish, and British rule, important divisions arose within the different scientific treatment of yaupon and its biomedical study. Though the Spanish and French chroniclers first wrote about yaupon, William Ayton, head botanist at the Royal Botanic Garden at Kew, recognized yaupon as a unique species, giving it its official scientific name, Ilex vomitoria, in 1789. The choice of the term is curious, and not only because the leaf had been marketed to a British public for decades under the moniker Carolina tea, but because yaupon had been cultivated in Britain since 1700, as Ayton himself noted, and it was actually cultivated at Kew Garden under Ayton's care at that very time. Though some may see Ayton's word choice as the influence of British imperial writing, which prioritized the ritualized regurgitation of the black drink ceremony, University of Florida applied ecologist Francis Putz calls the move a kind of economic sabotage. Putz claims that Ayton was secretly in the employ of Ceylon tea merchants who feared competition from Carolina tea and deliberately gave a name designed to invoke disgust. After all, Yaupon was at that time consumed on both sides of the English Channel. He could have, if he were curious, verified the emetic properties of the drink. Despite Ayton's official description, many writers have misapplied the name Ilex casein to denote Yaupon throughout the 19th century, perhaps as an attempt to distinguish Yaupon from its emetic reputation. And well into the 20th century, scientists have debated the correct scientific name for Yaupon. Yaupon was consumed in the North American South long before Walter Lenoir wrote his Mother of the Privations experienced during the Civil War. Multiple attempts at commercializing Yaupon had to contend with caffeinated competition, as well as something about the intersection of identity and usage. When John Locke specifically asked for Yaupon samples as part of his 1671 inquiry into potential commodities, tea had only been on the English market for a few decades, and caffeine had been introduced only a few years before that. Europe was only commencing its caffeine habit, and countries had not yet developed a firm preference for a particular product. The lack of successful commodification for Yaupon, I argue, did not lie on the production side of the equation. Although I want to ask the question, why did it not take? European settlers and Africans learned cultivation techniques from the original indigenous inhabitants of the land and planted massive Yaupon nurseries in the 18th century. Even if, which is 18th and 19th century, it's in deeds. Even if Yaupon manufacture in the 17th century did not have the same maybe market-oriented production as Chinese tea at the time, Carolina's indigenous and non-indigenous residents nevertheless knew how to grow and harvest it in large quantities. In addition to closer proximity to Western European markets and thus lower transportation costs, Yaupon also enjoyed a price advantage compared to coffee and tea for the North Atlantic market through the 19th century. So the price per pound was less for Yaupon than for the same amount of tea. So the key to the commodification puzzle is not in the production or the circulation aspects of the commodity chain. Instead, I think consumer identity had a critical role to play. During the outcry prior to the US Revolution, Yaupon was marked as an American beverage, consumed as a manner of protest against the British East India Company. But once the conflict died down, so too it seems did the urgency to drink Yaupon as a matter of defiance and newly forged patriotism, and trade seems to have subsided. Instead, the Southern plant became a solidly Southern drink. Quote, almost all the Southern coasters who frequent the port of New York are in constant use of Yaupon tea made from this vegetable, end quote, wrote the New York-based Medical Repository in 1806. Through its geographical association with the US South, Yaupon moved from being a cultural stand-in for things and people indigenous to things and people Southern. Early writings focused on Yaupon as ceremony through settler ethnographies of indigenous communities, or as we've seen on the medical and scientific import of the plant, highlighted here by Ayton. But the US Civil War remapped race, region, and cuisine in important ways. Francis Porcher's 1863 Medical Botany of the Confederate States cataloged plants that might be useful in the Confederacy, especially attentive to those that substituted for products previously accessed from the North or abroad. And just for our public, I realize our public is quite diverse. So the US Civil War was between, 1860, 1861 and 1865. So this was right in the middle of the US Civil War. Porcher in his medical botany writes of Yaupon using the South Carolinian nomenclature, casina. Rumors of Yopan usage during the US Civil War made their way to the Union. A letter to the editor in Scientific American at that time mentions that in consequence of the scarcity of tea in the South, Southerners are said to be reviving the use of Yopan. Yopan became, for the North and the South in the United States, a hallmark of wartime suffering in the US South, which may help explain why it was treated as a second-rate substitute to be abandoned once opportunity arose. And Northern cosmopolitan disdain towards white Southerners with attendant stereotypes around intelligence and violence attached to Yopan drinking after the war. Even within the South, Yopan suffered from strong geographical association. So as early as the 18th century, Yopan consumption among white settlers was a marked characteristic of the Carolina coasts. But perhaps most importantly, for Northern and Southern whites, Yopan was racialized. In 1864, in the middle of the US Civil War, the New York-based Farmers Club featured a small update with the detail. Quote, the leaves of these shrubs have been in use by the Aborigines of that district from time immemorial, and the Ilex cassine, or Yopan, constitutes the tea in universal usage there among the Negroes, which has given currency to the common Negro adage, fried hominy, possum fat, and Yopan tea is too good. The association of possum fat with Yopan is illuminating. Nicholas Proctor makes a case for racially ordered preferences when it came and comes to cuisine from the perspective of whites in the United States and the perceived inferiority of the consumption of racial minorities and particularly Black communities. Possum as Black game and as a Black meal is a repeated trope which appears in both 12 Years a Slave and Frederick Douglass's narrative. Moreover, possum hunting was a nocturnal activity and thus would not interfere with daytime duties. If possum and Yopan were parallels, as the dubiously common Negro adage implies, then the very Black taste for Yopan meant that a white public would not want to consume it. Whatever the reasons for Yopan's post-Civil War ebb, the long 20th and 21st centuries have seen repeated attempts to popularize the beverage for consumption, with success only recently. The US Bureau of Chemistry in 1922 prepared a circular for the production of beverages from Yopan and tested drinks at the Charleston County Fair. The Bureau's explicit mission was applied research, combining scientific inquiry with economic aims. And the writers enthusiastically stated that it was found in experiments that products from Yopan could be made very cheaply because compared to tea, because unlike tea, all the leaves on the plant contain caffeine. Unlike tea, the leaves could be removed from pruned branches with live steam. The number of steps of processing could be reduced, and the preparation of Yopan required very small amount of hand labor. It might have definite advantages to tea, but just at that time, Coca-Cola was on its ascent, and the new public company was capitalizing on production, on prohibition. And so whatever cultural space there might be for another caffeinated beverage was filled by an ice cold soft drink. Although Yopan was treated as a curio, if that, associated with the Carolina and Georgia islands for the bulk of the 20th century, new companies have arisen in the early 21st century to attempt what others have recommended, putting Yopan on the US stage. The new companies are built within the growing range of Ilex Formatoria in the US, Yopan Brothers in Central Florida, Cat Spring and Lost Pines in Texas, Yopan Tea Company in Georgia. Notably, none of these companies prominently feature the scientific name. The newly formed here, American Yopan Association, highlights permaculture, an emergent agroecological agricultural model that balances profitability and environmental stewardship. The new Yopan production model intentionally addresses both the labor excesses and the land impacts of extensive and intensive caffeine commodity production as part of the business model. Gone too is this anxiety about indigeneity. Instead, mention of a native past is prominently mentioned in all the companies. It is a marketing boon. And interestingly, there seems to be a blunting or even a transfer of indigeneity. Native has moved from describing indigenous people to describing the plant. The new production of Yopan redeems the mistakes of coffee, tea, and chocolate, and consumption also renders a transformative effect on drinkers by committing them ethically in right relationship with land and other people. So that's Yopan. And now, Guayusa. Whereas Yopan once circulated across the North Atlantic, Ilex Guayusa had a more regional footprint, stretching at one point from Colombia to Western Bolivia. Guayusa grows as tall trees on the humid slopes on the eastern Andes at the headwaters of the Amazon River. And there were groves still standing in Colombia in the 20th century that had been planted in the early days of contact. Like yopan and mate, the leaves are serrated and crenated with small, smooth teeth all along its edges. But guayusa is the largest of all three, about the size of a hand. And yerba mate is the size of a palm, and yopan is about the size of a finger, one part of a finger. A surprisingly well-preserved pre-Incan archaeological find attests to guayusa's importance in both ceremony and medicine. In the 1970s, a team of archaeologists and historical botanists examined a medicine man's burial in Tiwanaku, a site just south of Lake Titicaca in highland Bolivia, which included a carefully folded stack of Ilex guayusa leaves, along with a few other instruments, including a snuff dish and what appears to be an enema tube. Radiocarbon dating placed the pack of guayusa at 500 Common Era, 500, in our time. The fully intact leaves are just a little smaller than present-day guayusa samples and clearly indicate some kind of trait in the leaf because the Bolivian highlands lie outside the growing range of the tropical plant. Guayusa has a deep history of use by indigenous groups in the continent, and perhaps more than its two cousins, reveals that in its very physicality, reveals the evidence of long-term human intentionality. Guayusa has no seeds. And until recently, guayusa flowers had never been encountered, and the few that were located in a 1970s expedition to Ecuador were all staminate. They're all male. The lack of seeds and absence of flowers mean that guayusa cannot reproduce in the wild and that it depends exclusively upon human activity. Thus, all known samples of guayusa, either in laboratories or in the wild, are quite obviously domesticated and propagated by human cultivation in the form of cuttings. The lack of flower or fruit has long puzzled botanists who rely on the chew plus the leaves of a plant to aid in identifying new or existing species. English botanist and explorer Richard Spruce encountered it in his mid-19th century South American journeys, noting that he never either saw flower or seed, and that it was always associated with villages or now deserted indigenous sites. When Spruce ran out of coffee in eastern Ecuador, he decided to try his hand at making guayusa tea, which he deemed very palatable. But he also described how his Jibaro hosts made a guayusa infusion so strong that it becomes positively emetic, end quote. And that the Jibaro men took the drink early in the morning in order to empty their stomachs of whatever remained of the previous night's meal. That is, like yopan, indigenous practices around Ilex guayusa prominently feature regurgitation as a form of purification. But because he tasted the drink himself, Spruce knew that the plant was not normally emetic, and his experience of guayusa was not dominated by a politics of disgust. Instead, he attributed the practice to learned behavior. He wrote that Jibaro mothers taught their male children to regurgitate guayusa by giving them the drink and a feather with which to tickle their throats at a very young age. More recent ethnographic research on guayusa supports this. Ethnographers in the 1990s describe how Achuar Jibaro men in the Peruvian and Ecuadorian Amazon regularly drink guayusa in the pre-dawn morning, socializing and debating community life, after which they regurgitate the drink. Among them, at-will vomiting is a learned skill taught to prepubescent boys via the use of a finger or a feather. Blood samples from Achuar men having partaken in the guayus ceremony show that vomiting helps modulate caffeine intake, allowing participants to drink guayusa for extended periods of time. Guayusa also features in a hallucinogenic complex of plant-based ceremony among indigenous groups in South America. Anthropologist Stephen Hugh Jones makes an important distinction between normal foods and non-foods or anti-meals for indigenous groups in the Western Amazon with whom he's worked for decades. Normal foods like meat or cultivated plants nourish the body, whereas tobacco, coca, ayahuasca, and presumably guayusa nourish the soul. The holly has long been overshadowed by local hallucinogenic plants in much of the historical, botanical, and travel literature in the region, but there are remarkable connections between hallucinogenic plants and the psychoactive guayusa. Guayusa plays a role in the ayahuasca shamanic ceremony, where it may be drunk both before and after imbibing copy, the copy drink in order to temper the bitter taste of ayahuasca and alleviate hangovers after the ceremony. And there are gendered parallels between the ayahuasca ceremony, which uses copy, and the Wayu ceremonies. Early writers asserted that women were not permitted to participate in either, though in the present, these exclusions are not observed. Perhaps most telling, however, is the means of propagation. These psychoactive plants are extinct in the wild and have only ever been found as cultivated specimens, testament to a long interspecies relationship rooted in time immemorial. Kapi is traditionally grown from cuttings. That is, like Wayusa, Kapi is a clone of a particular plant carefully selected from all other Wayusa or Kapi by unknown individuals in a distant past, with all living specimens connecting past to present. And in fact, the best known stimulant of the region, Amazonian coca, is also propagated by stem cuttings by tribes in the upper Amazon in Brazil, Colombia, and Peru. These shamanic linkages, so decried by missionaries from the Catholic Church in the 17th century, have given Wayusa new life as a socially responsible eco-commodity in the 21st. In their last semester at Brown University, Tyler Gage and Dan McCombie came up with a business plan to start Runa, a company to commercialize and export fair trade organic Wayusa beverages. According to his telling of it, Runa grew out of relationships Gage had established with Quechua communities in Ecuador as he sought to explore Amazonian shamanic knowledge during a break from his studies. Grown via agroforestry, which Runa calls rainforest gardens, the commercialized Wayusa bears a strong commodity resemblance to the new Yaupon companies that have arisen in the southern United States to find new markets for old products based on new environmental and social sensibilities. Of the three Ilex beverages, Wayusa most resisted early moves towards commodification. And when international commerce finally came, indigenous ceremonial practice conducted by indigenous communities themselves has remained central to the messaging and the branding. For Yaupon, the move from Ilex as ceremony to Ilex as commodified caffeinated tea involved a rupture and a clear passage through a phase focused on Ilex as medicine. Here, Aiton's piece was a highlight of that. For Wayusa, the distinctions between ceremony and commodified tea are blurred, both as a result of marketing, but also as a result of production, since growth and harvesting of Wayusa is done by indigenous people in Western Amazonia. For yerba mate, the move to export commodity began in the 1540s as it circulated throughout the Spanish Empire, establishing its hold long before coffee and tea reached those regions. And if you're interested in learning more, I want to let you know that I'm working on a book on the cultural history of yerba mate, which will also address some more about Wayusa and Yaupon. And so once this pandemic ends, I want to invite you to join me in a round of one of these delightful drinks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. If you have any questions for Dr. Folch, put them in the Q&A below, and we'll get to that after our next presentation. But now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Hiroshi Yamada. Professor Yamada is not only one of Japan's leading researchers on the functionality of tea, but also a licensed physician and professor with the University of Shizuoka. His presentation is entitled Tea Catechins for the Prevention of Upper Respiratory Tract Infections. As he will explain, upper respiratory tract infections, including influenza, COVID-19, and the common cold, cause symptoms such as cough, sore throat, fever, and general malaise. Although there are various preventative measures against upper respiratory tract infections, they are not always effective. Since the early 90s, tea catechins have received increasing attention as a complementary preventative method. During in vitro research, tea catechins have been shown to inhibit the ineffectivity of viruses that cause upper respiratory tract infections, and studies have been conducted to clarify their effects. Remember to submit your questions using the Q&A function below, and a quick Q&A session will begin at the conclusion of this presentation. So please join me welcoming Professor Yamada.
Well, thank you very much for letting have opportunity to present my research work in this wonderful colloquium. I will show the slide. Please wait a few minutes. Yeah, this is the first slide. My title is The Catechins for the Prevention of Upper Respiratory Tract Infections. I am coming from Japan, so I present my research work. First of all, I would like to expose my conflict of interest. Most research grants from the Japanese government, granting aid Kakenhi, but in part, the Mitsui, Nori, and Ito and or cooperation was enjoyed in collaborating with my research work. And the study protocols, my research are always clinical research, so the study protocols were approved by the ethics committee at the University of Shizuoka and were conducted in accordance with the Health Declaration of Helsinki. And also, each study was registered in the NIH or human registration system before the starting the study. Here I will show my working place. Japan, the Shizuoka prefecture is the center of Japan in main Honshu Island. Shizuoka prefecture is between Tokyo and Osaka, about 180 kilometers west from Tokyo metropolitan city. So Shizuoka is very famous for the Mount Fuji and tea plantation area. I will show the tiny cozy flowers. These flowers are green tea flowers. It's beautiful, isn't it? So I'll show my university. My university has 5 schools, including pharmaceutical sciences, food and nutrition, and nursing, and so on. There are about 3,000 students. And also, many researchers are involved in the tea sciences, including me. And also, I went to Expo 2050 held in Milan, Italy. I participate as a delegate of the promotion of tea sciences and presented my research work in the Expo 2050 Milan. I will show the tea plantation area in Shizuoka Prefecture. This area is called Makinohara Tea Plantation Area. This area is very famous and almost #1 big tea plantation area. And also, you know that there are 3 types of tea: green tea, black tea, or oolong tea. In Japan, green tea plantation area is very abundant. Green tea is not fermented, so live components are very, a lot of live components existing. And also black tea is fully fermented and oolong tea is partially fermented. In green tea, there are lots of components, as you know. The 3 major components are catechin, polyphenols, and the theanine and caffeine. Other components, GABA, vitamin B, C, E, and minerals, and chlorophyll, saponin, fluoride is also contained. Among all those substances, catechin is very famous, and there are a lot of catechins included in green tea, especially epigallocatechin grade, EGCG. So I'll show the catechin, tea catechin families. Here, I will show the components of catechins in green tea. There are 4 groups of catechins in green tea. Epicatechin EC, epicatechin gallate ECG, and epigallocatechin EGC, and epigallocatechin gallate EGCG. The name is named for the esterized gallate and hydrolyzed family. Among the catechins, EGCG is abundant in green tea, and many researchers are studied with EGCG for the effects of the benefit, human benefit. Yeah, I show this in this slide the experimental results of the catechins for the functional benefits. So antioxidant effect is very famous, and also antibacterial and viral effects is also famous. Another effects, anti-obestic, anti-diabetic, anti-hypertensive, hyperlipidemic, and also anti-dementia, anti-allergic, and anti-carcinogenic effects are reported in the literature. But I would like to show, I'd like to emphasize all of these effects are in the experimental results. So in vitro or in vivo study. An in vivo study is about the rat rodent, right? Mice or rat studies. So human studies, there are not so many studies reported in human studies. Then I'll show the antibacterial and viral effects in catechin group. Yeah. First, I'll show you the bacterial effects. There are 2 major bacterial effects, bactericidal effects and antioxidant effects. For the bactericidal effects, there are many bacteria reported for the effects of catechins, such as Salmonella, Shigella, Vibrio, Helicobacter pylori, Escherichia coli, 0157, Staphylococcus aureus, and methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus MRSA, Mycoplasma, Polytetera legionella. For the antioxidant effect, Polytetera, Clostridium, Vibrio, 0157, MRSA are reported. All of these are bacterial effects. For the viral effects against upper respiratory tract infections, influenza, parainfluenza, adenovirus, alias respiratory syncytial virus, and also coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2 were reported in literature, in the experimental report. Among these viruses, influenza virus is very common for the effects of catechins. In influenza virus, there are 3 major mechanisms for the infectivity of influenza virus. The first, inhibition of attachment of the host cells against hemagglutinin HS spikes. Second, replication inhibition against viral RNA polymerase or nuclear proteins. And third, neuraminidase NA inhibition to suppress the release of viral progeny from infectivity cells. So these are a little bit complicated for the non-specialist. So I'll show the scheme of the mechanism in this slide. When the virus is infected into the host cells, there are three mechanisms. First, the virus absorbed into the host cells, and then proliferation, replication is occurred. After that, the release is from the host cell and prevailed to another cell. Infection is prevailed. In the catechin has a mechanism, three mechanisms: absorption and replication and release. Among these three mechanisms, I will show the absorption mechanism again. This is a scheme of the anti-absorption. The virus is infected with attachment of host cells, like that. The catechin blocks the absorption, like that, and then the infection is blocked. So we can speculate that green tea and green tea catechins will be promising for the prevention of upper respiratory infections. Then I will show the pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical preventive methods. Here, in the pharmaceutical methods, there are such a mechanism, such a measures are reported. Maybe you will do that way, in that way. In vaccination, it is very effective for influenza virus or SARS-CoV. Also, neuraminidase inhibitors are used for influenza infection. For the non-pharmaceutical measures, hand washing and face masks are popular. And gargling is not popular because it's almost Asian customs. Maybe in European United States, oral rinsing maybe is popular. Also, avoiding crowds is very useful. So, in many researchers, green tea and catechins have received great attention for the complementary preventive measures. Here I will show again the mechanism of the green tea for the prevention of upper respiratory infections. In green tea, there's many components. There are two mechanisms for the antiviral and immune enhancing effects. For the antiviral effects, catechins, theaflavin, and strepsin. I would like to say theaflavin is the component of black tea, not green tea. So for the enhancement of systemic immunity, theanine, vitamin C, saponin, catechin are also reported for the prevention. From here now, I'd like to show my studies for the preventing influenza and other respiratory tract infections. First, I'd like to show epidemiologic studies conducted in the elementary school children. I studied a survey was conducted. The survey was conducted for 2,663 pupils across the schools in Kikugawa City. Kikugawa City is the center of the Shizuoka Prefecture. It's near Makinohara plantation area. The questionnaire was completed and submitted. And then the 2,050 submitted, then analyzed. And response rate was 77%. The results shows in this slide. I show the association between the incidence of influenza infection and the drinking of green tea in a year. The slide shows the incidence of influenza drinking green tea 6 days per a week. Is significantly reduced the risk 40% compared to the group drinking less than 3 days a week. Also, I will show the amount of green tea consumption, green drinking. Compared to less than 1 cup a day, the incidence of influenza infection was significantly reduced 40% in the group drinking 1 to 3 cups a day and 3 to 2 cups drinking a day. I'll show the next study. I studied in the adults. I'll show the randomized double-blind clinical studies. In this study, we use the supplement, catechin and theanine supplements. So in adults, the result shows the incidence of influenza was significantly reduced compared to the placebo group. Here, I'll show the next slide. The past two studies are focused on the influenza infection. Here, I will show the study on the prevention of respiratory tract infection, upper respiratory tract infections. The slide shows there are 3 groups, high dose groups of catechin and low dose groups of catechin and placebo groups. The slide shows the incidence of upper respiratory tract infections was significantly reduced in the group taking high dose catechins. The amount of catechin is 57 milligram catechins 3 times a day. It is very significantly reduced. So these 3 studies are confirmed that the drinking or taking catechin supplements may be effective for the prevention of influenza or other colds. Then I studied another study for gargling. Here I will show the gargling habit in Japan. Gargling is very popular in Japan and maybe in another Eastern Asia countries. Here, gargling is prepared in elementary school or high school in adults for the prevention of flu or common cold. First, I studied the study with nursing home residents. Here, this is the nursing home residents. Yeah, I studied the gargling with 3 times daily gargling for 3 months against the prevention of influenza infection. Here I show the results. Catechin group number is 76. The incidence of influenza is significantly reduced compared to the gargling water. But the result is the cohort study, not randomized study. So the results should be very difficult to confirm. So we must do the next randomized control study. But the result is the first study in the literature in the world. So the American magazine, Let's Live, is introduced my research work in that way. Next, I studied the double-blind randomized control study for compound the result. Here I show the materials of the drinking. Here, the color and taste is just the same between catechin drinking and placebo group. Then the result shows in this slide. Unfortunately, the tendency as observed, the catechin group has a decreased tendency compared to placebo group, but not significant. So the result should be studied more. Then I studied another study was gargling in the high school students. The study was here in the plus one. The result shows the same. That it's not unfortunately it's not statistically significant. It's a decreased tendency. So the gargling is not so effective compared to the drinking or consumption. So we must study the next more concise or studies. So here I am now conducting the next study, and next research has now started from December 2021. It's now start going on to clarify the gargling effects of green tea for the prophylaxis of influenza or upper respiratory tract infections. Then I will show recent my work, a systematic review, a meta-analysis. Here I will show this study was published in European Journal Nutrition in 2021. The meta-analysis shown in this slide that we gathered 6 randomized control studies and 4 cohort studies. The total risk ratio shows 0.74. It is statistically significant. And in subgroup analysis, disease type, influenza and URTI, if the influenza result is more powerful compared to the upper respiratory tract infections. And also consumption type, consumption compared to gargling. Consumption is more powerful compared to gargling. So in these studies show the consumption and influenza infection, maybe it may be useful for the prevention of, but gargling and URTI is more. It needs more studies to confirm it. And finally, I will show the slide. T catechin against COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2. Maybe the audience have more make more attention for this result. In vitro study, not my studies, T catechins have been reported inactivity against SARS-CoV-2 in vitro study in a dose-dependent manner. And also, as a possible mechanism, affinity on the receptor affected cells has been considered. But, however, there have been few clinical control studies conducted so to confirm the efficacy. So it is so. So I will show the conclusion of my speech. These results suggest that green tea and catechins may be effective as an additional complementary measure against upper respiratory tract infections, including influenza and other viruses. Additional confirmatory randomized control studies conducted to clarify these effects. In addition, for the future perspectives, very rational drug design might be suggested helpful, such as how to increase catechin and green tea effects. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Yamada. It's very interesting to hear about green tea catechins and the prevention of upper respiratory tract infections, especially during the coronavirus pandemic. So very much appreciated. Now I'd like to turn it over to our student moderator, Kerrigan, for all questions and answers for Professor Yamada, as well as Dr. Folch.
So the first question for Dr. Folch is there a way to get traditional mate or yopan with the bombilla if living in the US?
Yeah, so right, you can find this definitely on Amazon, but and this is something that sort of gets hinted at through the circulation, particularly of yerba mate. In general, unless you are living in a place with a significant population of Argentines, Southern Brazilians, Paraguayans, Uruguayans, the best place for you to get it is going to be an Arab grocery store, because so many people from Syria and Lebanon consume it, that when you've got a store that's sort of target halal focused on Middle Eastern populations, they'll sell it. So where we live, there's a really great Palestinian little grocery store, and they're halal, and they have multiple selections of Argentine mate in bags. So that would be another place to actually go and sort of watch how mate has it's sort of see the globalization of mate, that if you're going to have a store that's going to sell hookahs, you also should sell mate. So that would be one fun thing to do. You can get it at Whole Foods. You can get mate at Whole Foods. You'll pay a lot, but you can get it there.
Great. And then the next question for Dr. Yamada. Do these benefits apply to oolong, black, and white teas, or only green teas?
Thank you very much for your questions. Maybe oolong tea and black tea, maybe it's also effective, because in oolong tea, catechin has included, and for the black tea, theaflavin is also the family of catechins are included. So the oolong tea and black tea also effective. I think so too.
And then the next question for Dr. Folch. You say that yopan is not emetic. However, couldn't the excessive caffeine of long brewed yopan be considered an emetic, since it lacks the theanine that Huyusa has?
So this is a really, so this question has like two layers to it, right? So there's one layer of like, okay, these, so the lesser known Ilexes, Ilex drinks are very much worth studying in terms of their chemical components and how the sort of, how they're put together. But I think it's, at least for the work that I'm doing, much more interesting to observe the public reaction towards public regurgitation with yopan historically compared to Huyusa, where there's regular public regurgitation, compared to yerba mate, which was regurgitated in the Spanish colonial record for hundreds of years. And Spanish Spanish priests wrote about it. People wrote about it in like the mainland. I mean, it was everywhere. And yet, although guayusa and yerba mate were and are vomited in public settings as part of a convivial kind of cultural ceremony, it's only Yopan that has to constantly combat the kind of, ooh, is it really emetic? So my paper, which was published in Comparative Studies of Society and History, reviewer two felt very strongly that I was wrong, that it was not emetic. And I actually had to go talk to indigenous groups in the United States who are like, look, what we do to make it emetic is, and they told me. So it's clear throughout the historical record from the 1500s to the present that things are added to black drink to make Yopan into something more than just a tea, but something that is sort of more ceremonial and has spiritual potency. And yet that common testimony by indigenous groups that describe how they do it and people who consume Yopan. So Yopan was majorly consumed in the US South, majorly consumed. All of that testimony is ignored compared to a scientific name given by somebody. And the difference between the authority that consumers have and preparers have over this drink versus a questionable name is, I think, really fascinating, especially compared to the Spanish and French treatment of Yopan. So the Spanish got there first, as you can tell, and they wrote about the vomiting like once or twice, but instead they were much more taken by Casina's use in community culture and bringing people together. There was a Florida indigenous ball game, right? We know a lot about the Mexican Aztec ball game, but there was actually a really important ball game ritual in Florida as well that was connected. So the French did not write about vomiting, even though they were here in Florida, and among casino consuming groups. So they did not write about vomiting and guayusa until the 1840s, 1850s. And it was only as a translation of an English document. So for hundreds of years, the French never mentioned it. It was mentioned instead as a drink of war. And so I think it's really interesting to see that we are so concerned with it being emetic because of a British naming practice that obviates other European testimony and the testimony of consumers. So I think that tension, I think, is much, at least for me, much more interesting and much more suggestive of how knowledge structures work. You can drink it. It's got less caffeine than green tea. It's really nicely balanced, and I'm telling you, it kind of when you taste it, you're like, this is what it is. I've had students do tastings. I've had students do clippings and brew it themselves, and they're like, oh my goodness, this is. It's kind of like the kind of thing your grandma would drink, and which grandma drinks great drinks. But so I think it's that angle that I'm more interested in, rather than like, well, if you brew it like for 8 hours, can you kind of make yourself sick? Maybe could you do that with tea? Could you do that with Camellia sinensis? Do we consider tea an emetic? Right, and I think that's the question I'm interested in. So thanks.
All right, and then for Professor Yamada, is it true that green tea can also facilitate zinc and other mineral uptake? And is it better in a powdered tea or a loose leaf form?
Excuse me, I beg your pardon?
Is it true that green tea can also facilitate zinc and other mineral uptake? Is it better in a powder tea or a loose leaf form?
You mean another components, you mean?
So like, does green tea help facilitate like the uptake of zinc and other minerals?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the meaning of the question. So,
like, does green tea help your body absorb minerals such as zinc and other compounds?
Sorry, I don't have any ideas. I'm sorry to say.
No worries. Then for a different question, which influence does the cultivar have on the effect?
Sorry.
Let me interrupt to translate English to Japanese to make Professor Yamada understand. 山田先生、すいません。品種において、その紅葉とかが、お茶の品種によって変わったりとか、そういうことあるんですかっていうことと、その前の質問は、その亜鉛の吸収とかが、そのお茶を取ることによって、より高まったりするようなことがあると聞いているんですけれども、それはパウダーのお茶で、より高まったり、リーフのお茶で、そういうことが高まったり、そういったそのお茶の形状によって、そのミネラルの吸収が、人によるミネラルの吸収がどうなるかということについて質問しています。今の質問は、その品種の問題で、その紅葉がその変わるのかということを質問されています。
そうです。すみません。答えられない問題ですね。わかりました。答えます。はい。I'm sorry. I'd like to say the answer. It is not my expert, so I cannot answer in such questions. But maybe the other experts will could be answer. I'm sorry to say that.
So then another question could be, is there any limit we should be aware of when drinking tea? And is there like any side effect of over drinking teas?
Yamada 先生、すみません。お茶の摂取において、その飲みすぎだとか、その適正なその飲用の回数だとか、前の先生は1日8杯以上とか10杯以上飲むとかえって悪いとかってお話しされてたんですけど、そういった点でお茶の飲む摂取量について、その許容限界っていうのはあるんですかっていうことですね。お願いします。
Thank you. Thank you. Ilex says the amount of drinking green tea is not freely understand, but the excessive drinking may be not good for the health. But the amount of high amount is not standardized. So it's in Japan, there are many people drinking 10 cups a day, but not they say no side effects. So it may be the difference of the human individuals. So maybe that such a safety study will be conducted in the future. Is it okay?
And then a question for Dr. Folch. Are there any contraindications for drinking Ilex teas, such as like in allusion to like hypertension, diabetes, certain medications, etc.?
So this is again like my colleague who just wrote. This is in some ways beyond my personal expertise. I'm coming at this as an anthropologist and somebody who's in history. So I'm a doctor, but not that kind of doctor. But I will say that I can't speak, is it going to be good for you and your particular health situation? But I will say this is a drink. These 3 Ilex drinks are drunk by tens of millions of people daily. So it's a very common beverage, and you can get both guayusa and mate at Whole Foods, like in the tea aisle. And there's no FDA says people who have hypertension shouldn't drink this. There are no caveats. There's no concerns, legal concerns written out there. So I think it's probably fine. My gut tells me that if you can drink black tea or green tea, you could, and by which I mean Camellia sinensis, you can drink the Ilex beverages. But this is a place where more research would be really great.
All right. And then for Dr. Yamada,
Yes.
in reference to the Ide et al. Study, what are some of the differences between your ongoing study and the Ide et al. Study?
Do you mean the difference of my studies and FACP study?
And the studies that you talked about in your presentation, specifically the Ide et al. From 2016?
You mean the precise of the ongoing studies, isn't it?
Yeah, so the participant asked in alluding to how the study from 2016 suggested that tea gargling could prevent influenza infection with statistical significance based on meta-analysis. So what's the differences between your ongoing study and that study?
Maybe the difference between gargling and drinking will be the mechanism of the infection. So in the gargling, the mechanism of prevention is focused on the absorption, but in drinking, the focused on not only the absorption, but also the release and duplication. Maybe it's the reason of the difference. Is it okay for your questions?
All right, and then another one for Dr. Folch. Does yerba mate grow outside of South American countries? Specifically, is it grown in Africa?
Oh, I love this question so much. No, it only grows in, I mean, I'm sure somebody could probably try to do it, but yerba mate is really, really, really hard to grow compared to Wayusa and Yopan. So Wayusa, you just clip it and you can, there are cuttings everywhere. Yopan transplants easily, and so it's common yard shrubbery. So it's one of the most boring looking plants. Anybody who lives in the US South, anybody who lives in Florida, anybody who lives on the Gulf Coast, and you're like, oh, I wonder, it's probably in your front yard because it's a really easy to grow shrub that requires, so there was a huge yopan bush outside of our dorm apartment for years, and I never saw anyone water it. It just grows so easily. Yerba mate is much more difficult to cultivate. And this was actually a really important puzzle that was solved by, in conjunction in the Jesuit missions, in relationship between the indigenous who were on the reductions, the missions, and the Jesuits themselves. And it was a technology that was discovered and then lost to time, although it was kept in time, and then rediscovered by Paraguayan German colony, Aryan white supremacist colony, in the late 19th century. So the question of how to plant and how to cultivate mate is actually much trickier, and it requires a very particular kind of soil temperature. So it has to be able to be really humid. It has to get below freezing 2 or 3 times a year, and that's it. So it's a very, very specific soil temperature. And the place where it grows is a very particular part of South America. And so it is not grown. I mean, you could try growing it somewhere else, but it is not grown elsewhere.
All right, and then I think this is going to be the last question for Dr. Folch. Do you have any advice for students trying to get into botanical history and the medical uses of plants from anthropology and ethnography perspective on how to get involved in this work?
Yeah, so I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I watch and participate and, do these kinds of things with people. But I think that one of the things that's super fun to notice is tracing how a particular commodity or a particular object changes over time. So for students who are interested, I would say, if there's something that if you find yourself fascinated by it, the first thing I would do is I would start creating my own personal archive. That is to say, use your Google Drive and save images, save files, tell your friends you're interested in. People send me photographs of mate everywhere in the world because they know I'm interested in it. And while you're creating your own personal archive of either documents you can find, there's lots that's digitized. I would also say that there are some really great classics to read. And so for me, the works that really captured my imagination, the first one was Sidney Mintz's Sweetness and Power, which is a story of sugar and how sugar, both in its production and consumption, reveals so much of the history of labor, enslavement, violence, imperialism. I think that was a book that for me, like, showed me how I wanted to put together my argument. I'm interested in production and consumption and what we learn about power in both. And so I would say, build your own personal archive, tell people you're interested in it, and read Sidney Mintz to sort of get a sense of what a commodity chain is and what part of that commodity chain captures your imagination.
Great. And then I think that is it for the questions. Now I will be handing it off to Professor Hardesty.